Today I'm speaking with Sarah Louise Gross. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi.
And I don't know too much about Sarah, so we're going to get to know her together, as I often say. But I know Sarah lives in Missouri with her husband, and she and her husband are nomad carpenters, which is awesome. I used to be a custom cabinet maker myself, so I definitely have an appreciation for that and the all the skills you pick up there and all the money you can save by doing things yourself. She was a homeschooling mom for many years. She grew up as a Navy brat and then a missionary kid with a Baptist organization. She grew up in South America and she went to Bob Jones University, which I can also relate to, at least for my freshman year. She has 7 kids and 5 grandkids. So before we get into the meat of your story, could you tell us just a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I do online karaoke. That's a hobby I picked up during COVID that I really enjoy.
That's fun.
I used to sing, in church and with my dad and things. And with the online karaoke, you also can sing with other people. So that's pretty cool. My husband and I recently bought and are probably now trying to sell our first sailboat. So we kind of learned the very basic essentials and decided it's a lot of work and might want a houseboat.
Gotcha. I'm curious with the online karaoke, you know how there's often like a brief delay and transmitting signals. Do you find that you're singing and other people are hearing you a second later or vice versa?
No, for duets, what you do is you actually lay down your track and then somebody else adds on to it,
Okay.
and layers over. But then you also can sing in live chat rooms. And at that point, you're singing, we can sing duets in the live chat rooms. And otherwise, it's kind of just like going to karaoke and people listen to you and you listen to them and there's a line. But
Yeah. The reason I ask is we have family that are not close by that will sometimes have them on FaceTime or something for one of the kids' birthdays.
mhm.
And as we're singing happy birthday, they start singing it and we realize that there's like a second or two delay. So as we're finishing,
No,
they're
we
still
don't usually
going.
have that problem.
Gotcha. That's awesome. Well, we're
Mhm.
obviously here to hear your story, so we'd love to get to know you. If you could, set the stage for kind of what your Christian worldview was like, and I especially love to hear about the Baptist missionary environment, what that was like. But take us to the earliest days, and we're
Sure.
looking forward to hearing your story.
Thank you. So yes, I was born into my formative years in religion were under IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist, in West Virginia. My folks were both from West Virginia. Neither of them came from churched homes. So they both, met the Lord as young teenagers. My father also went to Bob Jones. Um, and so I was born into when I was born, he was in the Navy, and they were starting I guess, a church plant. He wasn't the pastor, but they were in the definitely, the ground, the roots up process of that church. Very involved. I'm not sure. I was born in 1967. I'm not sure what year Jim Elliott and Nate Saint were killed, reaching out to the Aka Indians, but it was in there around that same time period. My father was very inspired by that story, was very taken, and convicted. And he knew already that he wanted to be a doctor. He was a general practitioner, but his dream was to to be a jungle doctor.
Hmm.
And it didn't he didn't take a straight route to that dream because he actually majored in Bible and minored in chemistry at Bob Jones. He was a preacher boy, but then went straight to medical school with his chemistry minor, which apparently just isn't done. But he did it, and then he did very well. His mother passed away overseas in the Navy, where his dad was stationed at the end of his first year in medical school, which caused him to miss some of his finals and flunk. So they actually let him repeat his first year, which also is unheard of. But he made it through medical school at West Virginia University, um, started his own practice. He served in Cyprus as Navy embassy doctor for a while. So I actually started school there in first grade. It was a British school. And yeah, my folks told me that I would come home and say, hello, mummy and daddy. But I didn't
Awesome.
keep that, unfortunately. Um, in my Venn diagram of cult exposures, which is just to me mind blowing because of the width and variety of it, starts actually there in Cyprus because a Jesus people cult of the 60s and 70s called the Children of God were around on the street, evangelizing, and my folks met some of them and then actually invited them into our home. And I don't know how long they stayed. It was 3 or 4 of them, I think. And I know they always told me, yeah, we gave them your room. And, you know, turns out now I know that this is a pedophilia cult. It's Jim Berg, Berg, was the head of that. And I don't really have visual memories of that time period. I don't really remember being around them. I just know that it was a fact, that they were in our home. So finished with the Navy, came back to West Virginia. Dad started a family practice there and was very successful, was an excellent doctor, well loved in the community, but he was restless. He still wanted to go to the jungle and be a missionary. So when I was, I think, 11, the folks joined ABWE, Association of Baptists for World Evangelism, which is based out of Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And I remember they went to Bermuda for their missions conference. And because we got left behind with, some friends for a couple of weeks. And so they went out, they got all inspired and hyped up, and the mission plugged them into a medical team that was already in formation. And there was my dad, a surgeon, a couple of nurses, a x-ray tech, and a lab tech. And then they just sort of brainstormed and kind of told the team, here are, your options of where a hospital is needed in different places around the world. Why don't you guys pray about it, talk about it? And so they picked basically the middle of the Amazon. My dad went down there for a surveying trip on like a little seaplane or whatnot, and I remember the slides and pictures of that trip. And of course, we at that point were on full-blown deputation, which is where the missionary family goes around, do all the churches that they can contact and present the work to get financial support.
About how
My
old would you have
dad
been at that point?
like 12.
Okay.
And we were also at Bob Jones during that time period of my life, junior high, for my mother to get the required Bible training, formal Bible training to be a missionary wife with the mission. So we were there for a couple of years. I went to school with and was in class with for those 3.5 years with Bobby Jones IV, which was the son of the president at that time. Knew the family well, knew him well. He was the sweetest guy. He was a great guy. Loved him.
Yeah, I
Later
actually
on,
had
he
him
decided
as a teacher myself eventually.
because he wrote for, was it World Magazine, I think,
I
later
think so,
on
yeah.
after he left the
Yeah.
college. But later on, he decided he didn't want anything to do with being the president, and so his younger brother stood up and took the plate. So we were there for a couple of years. Bob Jones, my dad was a campus doctor at that time, so technically was considered a faculty kid. But since I was kind of new kid on the block, I never made the inroads into that culture, I'll just call it. But I later found out, of course, we all know this, that those were all the kids that were never keeping the rules. Everybody else had to, but that was a different set of rules for them. So I was in 9th grade when we first went to Brazil. it was language school. It was Manaus, a city of 1 million people. We were small town kids. So that was a huge change. My dad had been taking Portuguese lessons for a year or 2 years before we went. And he actually preached a sermon in Portuguese our first Sunday there, and it was good.
Wow.
Um,
So he really had a
I'm
language aptitude.
Oh, he did, and he had grown up Navy brat too, so he had learned Greek in Cyprus as a teenager, and also German in Germany. But my mother really struggled with the language, and that was a stress on their marriage, I think, and on the whole family, because she was an extrovert, always had been a talker, and suddenly, she couldn't communicate. And so that year of language school, I actually did correspondence. There was like a little mission school kind of just down the road from our house. I walked down there, got out my paces from the ACE program, finished them as fast as I could so that I could read whatever I had on my reading list of personal reading. Um, it was being in a Catholic country as a Protestant. That was a whole new ball of wax, and also it did broaden my exposure. That's probably where the broadening of my exposure to other denominations, or at least other ways of doing things, started, because there were a lot of missionaries around from other denominations, other missions. People dressed differently. People, had different standards, and I was like, oh, okay. Because up to that time, it had been strictly no pants, no rock music. I grew up listening only classical or gospel and things like this. So
And I assume as
at the
good
end of
Baptists, they saw the Catholics as unsaved and needing the
they
gospel.
were definitely unsaved. And at the end of language school, the other missionaries basically said, this couple, my parents' marriage is not doing well. They need to go work on that before they really dig their feet in. So we got sent back for a year and sort of plugged into the missions counseling program, which happened to be in Lafayette, Indiana. 10th grade for me. So here I am again, huge, instability, new kid, new place. No, I was shy, they were kind of examining our whole family, and we felt it, under the microscope for sure. Very awkward, just super self-conscious. Everywhere I went, though, I seemed to be able to cotton onto one close friend, which had happened, at Bob Jones in junior high. And it was usually the underdog, that's who I kind of clicked with. And again, in Lafayette, I found a friend. And because I knew like this much Portuguese, I helped her in Spanish class, and we bonded, and we still communicate to this day. So that was a bright spot in a very difficult year. Um,
Can I
Not to
ask,
give too much of, mhm.
could I take us back just for 1 second? You're mentioning your young teenage years. At what point did you have a like a conversion experience? What did you trust Christ as a young child, or was that later?
So I did the typical, Jesus prayer as like a 4 and 5 year old, which I later didn't remember, but they told me that I had done that. Um, it was around, so it would have been in junior high at Bob Jones. I was 11, as I recall, when I requested to be baptized. So that was when I remember feeling like I had some ownership of the faith, that it was going to be my decision, for me, not necessarily just something that I inherited. I felt that I was a spiritual kid. I I prayed, I read the Bible, I did my quiet times. I had a longing for something more, but I wouldn't have been able to describe probably at that time what that something more was. But
Mhm.
um, what I had witnessed, we weren't in an environment where there was praise and worship music. It wasn't like people being emotionally expressive or speaking in tongues or even speaking out really too much in the service. Everything was fairly buttoned down. So probably that was part of what I was missing out, feeling a desire for was ability to just express some emotion, some passion, because I read poetry. I was a big reader. I read all of the Tarzan series, all of the Agatha Christie series, but, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Edgar Allan Poe, it had to be a lot of pathos and, I think partly because I was shy and not super verbal, that enabled me to connect, with my feelings in a way that was more internal, but was still meaningful.
Mm.
So I got baptized at 11. Don't really remember much about that, just that it happened and that it was, my choice. It was never, although I grew up in an environment of very much hellfire and brimstone preaching, a lot of guilting from the pulpit, a lot of shame-based theology, but in my own home, my father was not that way.
That's
In
awesome.
fact, I would say, he passed in 1998, but had he lived on past through COVID and all the things, Trump and whatnot, I sometimes wonder, where his faith would stand today because he was an intellectual. He just lived and swam in a very small pond. And also he was not a rebel though, which I ended up being. But he did always tell me, I felt that the feeling that I got from him, I always knew that he unconditionally loved me and that he unconditionally approved of me, even though he might not necessarily understand my path or my struggles, but he
Mm.
always gave me the the confidence to feel that it's okay to ask hard questions, that you don't have to be afraid. Truth is truth, and it's not to be feared.
Mm.
So
What a
he did
what a blessing.
instill that in me, which I'm so thankful for.
That's awesome. Real quick,
Um,
before you jump to your story again, could you clarify for people that might be watching that might not be from a background that would relate to? What was it? I mean, you said you were baptized. I know that that's kind of the outward evidence of an inward conversion. What were you actually doing when you said, "I'm truly a Christian"? Like, what is it? What would you have said if say a friend of yours had come up and said, "I see what you're doing. I see you're talking about this, and you're giving your testimony. You're getting baptized. You talk about being saved. I don't think I'm saved. What is that? What does it mean? And what did you do?"
right. To me, it was me agreeing that yes, I had been born with a sin nature. There was nothing that I could do to repair that broken relationship with God because He was holy, I was in sin. In the gospel, we would call it, um, the remedy to that was God sent His Son to the earth to be incarnated as a man to suffer what we suffered and to ultimately lay down His life and be sort of the Old Testament type sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, which was the remedy for the sin nature.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't. I wasn't one of those kids where the idea of hell or the afterlife or punishments really weighed on me that much. I really focused more on the moment. I think I was much more sort of not so worried about what might happen after I die or like what if I would die tonight. I don't remember any anxiety over that. Although that it's pretty amazing considering on the preaching and teaching that I did sit under. I don't know how I sort of just boxed that off, but I did.
Mm.
I have a lot of friends, you know, and peers who really suffered terrible anxieties over that. And I don't know. I wasn't so susceptible to that. But
Mm.
at that time, you know, that I was baptized, it was me professing to the community. So it was kind of I saw it, and I think it was seen as a rite of passage, as a sign of maturity almost, because in that environment, everyone assumed you were already saved. You know, if you'd been born into it, you definitely had done the prayer, you know, at some point in Sunday school, because there was a lot of pressure, you know, peer pressure and sometimes pressure from parents and things. Um, when I had my own kids, you know, it was important to me that as when they were little, you know, that we kind of get them in there, you know, and make sure they have that opportunity to, with their limited understanding, you know, to just be part of it.
Yeah, I think we all kind of grew up with that sense too, that the age of accountability is always looming, and you know at
Yeah.
some point, you know, whatever that magic age is between 11 and 14, somewhere in there, you know, it's going to hit our kids and they're going to hit it, and at that point they need to have all the tools and the background knowledge to
And
know you need Christ, you know.
and God forbid that, you know, a kid might go 5 or 6 years in blissful ignorance of their horrible sinful nature, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
So after the baptism, shortly after that, we had gone for language school in Brazil. So I show up, you know, in Brazil as a baptized missionary kid. We're all good, right? And nope, we got to go back to the States and get, you know, from my parents to get marriage counseling. You know, that I'm sure was extremely humiliating for them. And it was somewhat humiliating for me because you know, I was aware I had two younger brothers. One would have been like 9 and the other one was 4 at that time. So they were a little bit oblivious of the reasons and all the things. They just knew that we were getting uprooted again. But in the counseling, um, I guess I'll cut in and kind of give a little backstory on this now. I've talked about my father, and we were close, but my mother and I, we weren't. And that had been from the beginning. Um, all the reasons, some of it was mental health related. There were some jealousies on her part, you know, because I was close to my dad, and she felt threatened, and so she would um, try to undermine and different things. But with the counseling that was needed, I'm just gonna, you know, I'm biased, but I'm gonna say it was 90% on her, what the issues that they were having. But when they went back to Indiana, she was very good, and she manipulated the counselors into basically throwing my dad completely under the bus. And I witnessed this happen. You know, I witnessed him be just defeated, um, take all the responsibility, and her just sort of skate scot free off into the, you know, um, back to Brazil. And so that was a formative event for me. And as I watched my parents' marriage before and after that, you know, it was never good. It was always, I have been diagnosed with complex PTSD, and a lot of that was because there wasn't outward fighting in the home, but there was constant tension in the home.
Mm.
And there was no communication.
Yeah,
There was, you know, there was just a lot of unhealthy
yeah,
patterns
like walking on eggshells a lot.
being laid down. Yes. And so I didn't grow up having a great opinion of, you know, what marriage could be or should be. Um, after the counseling in Indiana and they got released to go back to the field, at that time I was going into 11th grade already. And I heard about there was a new tribes mission school outside of Manaus. literally in the jungle. There were no roads to it. You had to go by boat. And this school, the name of it is Purakekwara, which means electric eel in the Indian language. It had been established in like the late 50s. So it was an old established boarding school. I was kind of sweet on a boy that was there. We had kind of met in town and whatnot, and they were with our mission. The folks took me out to investigate, and the first thing that they noticed was the girls were wearing shorts. Um, Everything else was fine, but we talked to the teachers, we had the interview, we took the tour, and when we got back home, they sat down with me and they said, well, they weren't crazy about the idea of boarding school to begin with, but they could tell that it was clear that I needed more, in terms of education. The paces in 11th grade weren't just quite cutting it. And they said, well, you can go, but you're going to have to wear culottes. And I was like, then I'm not going because, at 16 and a half, I literally was the last thing I was going to do was put myself in a situation like that. It would not have been worth it. So I put my foot down, and I said, then I'm not interested. If I have to be the one person that's dressed differently, forget it. So they caved and they let me wear the shorts and they let me go. It was two of the best years of my life. Um, like I said, a lot of my friends, who probably had been shipped off to boarding school in kindergarten or first grade, didn't have the same experience that I had. They ended up with trauma. But for me, it was great. It was like summer camp all year long. We wore flip flops to class. We got to swim in the Amazon. We literally would get on a boat, go to Manaus, which I said earlier was a city of 1 million people. The only rule was we had to stay in groups of 2 or more. They would let us off at the boat dock and be like, it might be say 10 in the morning, 11 in the morning. And they'd be like, well, be back for the boat at probably 7 at night. We went up in a taxi and did whatever the heck we wanted for, 6 or 7 hours with no supervision. And we weren't bad kids, but we were having a ball. We were shopping, we were eating, we were just living our best life. So graduated 1985. Where am I going to go to college? It's not furlough year for my parents. So they're going to still be in Brazil. The only school I'm familiar with is Bob Jones. And that's an easy approval from my folks. I knew, I wouldn't have to fight for that. So that's what I did. I showed up with my suitcase. I think my mom came back with me. My dad couldn't, but mom came back. She got me in the dorm and settled, and then she went back to Brazil. But immediately it was like, oh God, what have I done? Because the freedoms were gone. The freedoms that I had in boarding school, as a high schooler, that was a thing of the past. It was, um, when we went off campus, the drill. Of course, for guys, it was a little different, but as girls, we had to go to the Dean of Women, say where we were going to be, who was going to be in the vehicle, and what time we were going to be back. And then when you came on campus, it was a guard post that checked your permission slip. One time I had a car that year. I took 3 or 4 girls to the mall, and there was a bad girl at the mall that didn't have permission. She'd gone off without permission. So one of us rode back in the trunk.
That's awesome.
And I have to say, I was there as a town student the following year after that, which was a furlough year for my parents. So it ended up being in the dorm 2 years and towny 1 year. I really did have a blast, regardless of the rules, because I didn't give a flip about any of them, and I tried my best to get expelled, but didn't. So yeah, it's a whole different experience, like from my dad when he was there. Never once wanted to break any rule. He just
Mm.
didn't have the desire. He was happy. He was doing his best life already. And me, I was just, I had tasted freedom.
Yeah. Well, can I
And
ask
so
what was your personal relationship with God like at that point? Like, where even despite the cultural differences of you having lost some of that freedom, was there still like a growing relationship with the Lord behind the scenes?
there was for sure. There were a lot of things I was curious about and that might have been sinful or possibly not, depending on, I guess, people's different viewpoints. But I was always too chicken, usually, to step over the lines. So my rebellions were very mild. They were, very normal and age appropriate. A girlfriend of mine and I that were in the cosmetology program together, we would have long hours of cosmetology lab where we were supposed to be rolling perms or whatever, for maybe 3 hours. She and I would stroll off to the bathroom, get in my car and go to the lake and then just stroll back in, before the class was over. And just things like that. One time we found a loophole in the rule book where we discovered that if we decided that we were extremely tired and just couldn't make it, we could check ourselves into Barge Memorial, which was campus hospital, for a rest break. And that was put in there because kids literally were just having breakdowns, um, from stress. And so she and I simultaneously checked into the hospital together and then sent our freshman roommate off campus to get pizza for us and bring it and just like had a party. The
That's
nurses
awesome.
were confused. They were confused, but we had a ball at Bob Jones.
Hmm.
I finished the cosmetology program there, and spiritually, while I was there, I sort of I started to get a little cynical for sure because I did see a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of legalism. I saw, you know, I had seen enough of the outside world and I had traveled at that point, quite a bit. One of the times that I went back to see the folks in Brazil, I flew, from Miami through Bogota to Colombia by myself, as an 18-year-old. And so here I am, in Greenville, South Carolina, in this very stifled, supervised environment, just kind of sort of busting out here and there, a little bit, but still very much connected to my own personal faith. Still, even though I somewhat resented, like all of the chapels and all of the Bible memory classes that we had to do, but yet, I still owned my own personal prayer time. I still definitely, had a prayer request list of people that were on my heart, that I interceded for, that I felt responsible to do that. Um, I think maybe a lot of people can relate to this too. I think I did hear someone, I feel like it was on your channel, to say that in their personal prayer life, they felt they could ask things for other people, but not necessarily for themselves. And I
Hmm.
definitely related to that. Um, there was a lot of programming done that I never realized until I was more out of it, that told us to do things that are self-care or to do nice things for yourself, was selfish and bad.
Hmm.
Or even to want good things, you know, because your treasures aren't here, they're laid up in heaven and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. The whole die to yourself, die to your desires kind of thing, and ranking yourself lower than everyone else. and certainly just the example of Christ, where where Christ could have clearly, as he says at the cross, he could have commanded 10,000 angels to come intercede, but he just kept on willingly laying himself down and putting, ranking himself lower, even though he didn't have to, and that subservience was truly that humility was the path of glory, to be not speaking up for yourself, to lay down all your rights and your interests. Um, and yeah, it's I definitely can relate to that. It's interesting how much it gets in your psyche.
In the Gothard circles, they have what's called I think they call it the ministry face. And I know this because we were very close to some families that actually worked in the Indianapolis Center, and they had teenage daughters, and they would tell us that, they literally policed their facial expressions when they worked there, because to come out into public appearing less than joyful and excited was to be a stumbling block to your brother, in a sense. So there was not that amount of pressure on me, but it was kind of absorbed, for sure, in the environment.
Mm.
Saw all kinds of varieties of missionaries, kind of going back a step back to Brazil. There were veteran missionaries that kind of were just beat down and resigned. There were veteran missionaries that still really loved it, and were still living their best life. There were newbies who came and just, like it just destroyed their marriage, or it just destroyed, their mental health immediately almost. There was not a lot of resources or support, for people making these huge transitions. You kind of just were, as long as you had a dollar amount of support, that was the important thing. They felt they could release you into, your ministry, but then it was sink or swim. My folks, I think my mom somewhat sank, in many ways. My dad, it was his dream. He was living his best life. It was what he was good at. My mother she didn't have the heart. She really enjoyed the status of being a doctor's wife. Um, and there was a little bit of that attached to being a missionary wife, but the harsh realities of missionary life in the jungle was something else. And in the end, they ended up actually coming back literally because she was hot.
Yeah.
She just couldn't handle, the weather.
I was just going to add too that I think the contrast of your dad's passion for that, and how it's really, there's an arrogance that comes of like what a great thing, we should all as Christians be trying to share the gospel, but what a great thing to share the gospel with those who otherwise have no real access to it. Maybe they don't even have a Bible in their own language yet, and to be directly working with the team that's going to be doing that. There's no greater calling to share the gospel with the lost, of course, to be bringing people to the kingdom, but especially in a context where, kind of like as in Isaiah 6, God says, who's going to go for us? And Isaiah says, here am I, send me. And for your dad and people like him to say, I will gladly lay down my life. I'll be one of those people. Here am I, send me. I want to do it. You take my money. Let's do it. And that arrogance, and I certainly felt it too, of like, why isn't everyone else saying these people are dying
Right.
without the gospel? We need to be on this train. Like, we should be pushing each other to get out the door of our churches here, here in America, and get to the lost. And here I'm doing it. And there's an arrogance there that comes into that equation. But I think for the people that are struggling, where it's like you said, the weather issue, the culture, even something like bugs, or can't get the right food you want, a lot of issues, getting sick, a lot getting malaria or whatever. All these issues kind of combine, and for a lot of people, it is a living nightmare to be there. And you kind of are like, I
Yes.
want to be that perfect Christian that's just willing to give up
You don't want
everything.
to admit it, that you
Yeah,
can't hack it.
but this
Yeah.
really really sucks. Like, it really is horrible, and it's a hard thing. And I could definitely see marriages being crushed by it, especially if the person that is
Right.
proud of their choice is like
Right.
looking at the other person saying, why in the world wouldn't you want to be here? This is the best life possible.
Right. It was interesting. My dad, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that he would have gone without being a doctor, although he did become a preacher first. But medicine was his gift and his passion. And when I watched him there, he was a good preacher, but I couldn't imagine him just doing that. You know, his real passion was ministering to people in the physical. So, he had a burden for people's souls, but it kind of seemed like it was pick second place to, the more immediate needs,
Yeah.
so to speak, that people had.
Mm.
When I stayed out, because I did stay out between my freshman and sophomore years at Bob Jones, and just stayed at home with the folks in Brazil because I was lonely and homesick for Brazil. At that point, I kind of imagined myself always living in Brazil because I had kind of done the thing as a third culture kid where now it didn't seem like the US was home anymore, and I didn't fit in there anymore. And I really hated it.
Mm.
So I stayed out a year, and that year I actually taught my youngest brother his schooling. And I just tagged along with my dad. I got to, develop x-rays at the hospital. I got to watch him deliver babies because he did everything. There was a surgeon there on the team, but because of the amount of purchasing and red tape and documentation that they always had to be dealing with, it seemed like it was only ever one of them at the hospital at one time. They didn't really overlap very much. One of them usually was gone. So when the surgeon wasn't there, my dad did all the surgeries. He actually, two that I remember that stand out: a child fell and impaled himself, fell from a tree, impaled himself on a fence post. And so it kind of had gone like through the intestines, and dad operated on him. I don't remember the outcome on that one. I think that child might have died because it was a really severe, and their hospital was quite small. Their one that was a super surprising success to me. A lady got her hair caught in the outboard motor shaft and just scalped her, and dad did literally skin grafts on this woman, and it was a pretty much a miracle that she survived because of the possibility of infection down there. It's so strong, and can just happen so fast. But she survived, and he actually went to town and bought her a wig. And I remember her wearing that wig around and being so proud of it. But the hospital and the training that they did with the local people to enable them to sort of be the support staff, it made a big difference in that community. And the people were quite grateful. A lot of them converted, a lot of them stayed Catholic, but they certainly saw my father as their friend, and he saw it that way. There were some missionaries where you got the very clear sense that they felt themselves above, their local people that they ministered to. But I never felt that, and I don't think the people felt that from my father. He was just one of them, and
Mm.
he wasn't ostentatious. We had money, that he had saved and earned as a doctor in the States, but he didn't spend it on himself. He didn't spend it on us, an interesting thing at that time in the 80s, the exchange rate was such that you could, and many missionaries did go with, their normal support and make quite, some bank. And then they would buy toys, but yeah, my dad didn't do that.
Mm. Did you have an understanding or a pressure that you needed to become a missionary yourself when you were an adult and done with college?
In the family, no, but in the general culture, yes. Yeah, in fact, quite a few of my friends from boarding school were already second and third generation missionaries. And many of them, in my opinion, came back to their fields that they grew up on because they just had no tools, to survive here in the States and had no idea how to be an American.
Hmm.
So it wasn't necessarily for them, a calling. It was the only option that they
Yeah,
felt they had.
it's so sad. So at this point in your story, you weren't yet questioning the Christian worldview at all. You were fully
Not
in
at
it still at this
all.
point. Okay.
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, it is a true statement that until my divorce 2 years ago, was 2 years ago in May, I didn't have any friends that weren't church people, that weren't Christian. I was 53 years old and had been in that much of a, because I stayed at home. I didn't work outside the home. I went to church, church and home and church. Um, so I'll get to that part later, but I love being amongst and having, so many friends now that either are deconstructed or just never were in the church to begin with. And those are my favorite people.
Hmm.
But
Amazing.
so as a 19-year-old at this point, I've come back to stay with my folks, to teach my brother. The middle brother was at a different boarding school by this time, but the younger one, they didn't want to send him so far away. It would have been about 2,000 miles away from them, and he was only in, I think, fourth grade at that point. So they let me do it. I was happy to do it. We hung out, we were buds. He learned some things. He was very smart, so I don't think it held him back or anything. Um, then I went back to Bob Jones for my last year. Um, Kind of changing. The story sort of shifts a little bit at this point, I guess, because I'm about to be just um, to my own devices, and it's like it's December of the middle of that last year, and I'm in an unwise relationship with a guy who'd been blacklisted at Bob Jones, who'd been kicked out and was living in town. I should have been kicked out just for hanging out with him if it would have been found out. So I'm kind of embroiled in this. It's not a healthy thing. I go home to Brazil at Christmas for a 3 week break. And I've been hearing, my mom's been writing me that they hired this young man from Kansas to come and teach my brother, the same one that I had taught. Um, he was going to teach my brother, and he was going to teach the daughter of the surgeon. So he actually was in college, but he stayed out a year to do that for them. He had met my mother in a different part of Brazil where he had a family member who was a missionary. He was doing a short term, helping them out, and met my folks. And he said, "Yeah, I'm in education." And they said, "Well, we have a son that really needs a teacher. Would you consider staying out of college for a year? We'd pay you." And so he agreed to do that. He was living with my parents. Um, I went home for Christmas break. I We met. This was my first husband, father of my babies, and before I went back to college at that end of that 3 week break, we were engaged, to be married. Um, this is where I'd kind of like to talk about purity culture. I know it's something you talk about a lot with it. It affects so many. I mean, who does it not affect growing up in church? And when I look back on, I was married for 32 years. Why did we get married? And why did it happen so fast? Well, it was two different reasons for me and for him. As I see it, obviously he's not here to speak for himself, but this was my observation. Um, for me, it was definitely the sense of security of me not having a clue how I was going to make it in the States on my own. And I was terrified. Um, for him, it was that teaching, that Paul says it's better to marry than to burn, because he was a healthy 20-year-old young man and he was burning, and it really bothered him. He was also a very spiritual young man and he wanted to do right and he was struggling, and so we met. We kind of clicked, like we had the basics in common, right? Um, our spiritual background, kind of intellectually matched well, and then we were both not repelled by one another.
Was he interested in ministry as well, as far as you knew?
He was, and when I met him, the fact that he was in Brazil when I met him enabled me to kind of project the possibility that, we might come back, or at least he could kind of relate to where I came from. He'd been there, he lived there for, ended up being like a year and a half. So he had some exposure. Whereas when I would talk to people in the States, usually nobody cared. Like they didn't really have an interest in hearing about Brazil. They couldn't really picture it. Some of them thought it was in Africa, things like that. So
That's crazy. Not surprising, sadly, but crazy.
um, so I think he thought, hey, this might be a God thing, I think was his, because he was literally looking for a wife. He definitely was looking to wife somebody up. And here I was, and we kind of, made each other laugh and thought I was cute. And, as a missionary kid, so I'm already, that's evangelical royalty right there. So he put a ring on it, and I just, again, I also thought, hey, this is probably a God thing, and that was really, I did have a sleepless night once he popped the question to me because he didn't want me to go back to college and not have it nailed down, He was still going to be there for the spring semester teaching my brother in Brazil, and I was going to be in South Carolina. So I was shocked and appalled to hear the words come out of his mouth that, I think we should get married. And then I spent a sleepless night and I just said, God, to me, it didn't make any sense, really. I knew I didn't love him, but I just thought, this seems like it's so unlikely and sudden and unexpected. I wasn't out here looking for it. It's got to be a God thing. So to me, that it was just after that, it was a no-brainer, you know. So we departed out on this journey of 1,000 miles. And I know everybody, including my father, he did try to put a few words of wisdom in, of caution. And at that point, we were both just like, no, this is what we're going to do, So
It seems like
got
too there's
married.
such a strong message that's given in those circles of love is not a feeling, it's a choice. And so,
Yes.
especially if you
Yeah.
see, like you said, God working probably providentially through your lives, and especially if you see that He could use your gifts and talents together so beautifully to do ministry.
It was just logical,
Yeah, yeah. The pieces they
um,
don't fit from this side, but they fit back then. Yeah,
I had a high school teenage, first love experience. So I knew what that felt like. And I knew that this wasn't like that. And I think that one of my first mistakes was from the beginning, I told myself to not expect it to be like that. That I adjusted my expectation for sure. Um, so as a 21-year-old young woman, and I'm a virgin, he's a virgin. Um, we got married. It was traumatic, from the honeymoon phase point of view, and just just getting through, having sex for the first time and making that mental shift. I literally have repressed. Like I think I very much disassociated during, the first couple of months. Was not enjoyable, was not, romantic, really. But it was legal. That was the important thing, you know. And I actually was on the pill. I don't really remember how that came about, except for a doctor at Bob Jones prescribed that to me when I said, when I was planning to get married. There at that time, that's just what they kind of did. I got the pill and I got Ed Wheat's book, Intended for Pleasure, which is just an abomination, but was of no help whatsoever,
I'm surprised
Um,
that they would recommend birth control though, Bob Jones. I didn't know that.
yeah,
I would have
yeah,
thought
they
they would have
did.
been the complete opposite.
They did. In fact, they almost kind of pushed it on me.
Interesting.
So I didn't know any better. I had done no research. I did not take to it well. Like it um, hormonally was not the thing for me. I started struggling with a lot of depression right away. Of course, I was also a newlywed in an isolated situation with no friends and in a foreign country to me, So there was that. But fortunately, in a way, we stayed on the pill for the first 5 years. We didn't start having kids immediately, which was a good thing. But
Hmm.
when we did start having children, I really identify that as the beginning of the dark time. And because suddenly, your choices and your decisions don't just affect you anymore. There's a whole lot more at stake. I definitely grew up pretty fast, and I took it seriously. My responsibilities as a parent, spiritual, physical. When our oldest daughter got to be school age, my ex was teaching at a Christian school at that time, and she could have gone tuition free. But we had met a family who homeschooled their children, and we were impressed with these kids, and we talked about it. And my ex's schooling experience, he'd been in public school and had just hated every minute of it. This wasn't a public school, but he still had a lot of anxieties about, how will it be, for her going to school. We just decided we're going to try to homeschool, what the heck, these people have done it. Surely we can do it. And it was obviously going to be on me because, he worked outside of the home 40 hours a week. But I just had the confidence of youth. And, I thought, how hard can it be? And so at that time, it was pre internet. So I went to some conferences and talked to some people about curriculums and kind of cobbled together, some preschool type of things. And we sort of split into it easily at first. And it didn't really seem like schooling. It was just hanging out with your kid, like you would normally do and teaching them phonics and things. And at that point, we were in a non-denominational church now. My ex had not come from the Baptist background. So when we got married, I experienced a different way. There was worship music. There were people who probably spoke in tongues, not in the service, but privately at home. We ended up working with the youth group at that church before we had our own kids, and took a group to Mexico with a Pentecostal group, and everybody spoke in tongues, including us at that time. So things were moving along, in my faith was growing. It was being challenged in different ways, but it was kind of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. It wasn't a consistent climb, but I was still, being very faithful, always in church. I was a concordance girl. Like I had the Bible out with all the things, on the desk. And this is while I'm trying to, be pregnant and have a toddler and homeschool. So at that time, I sort of had left my freewheeling, days were behind me. Things were serious now, and um, we
Can I
weren't
ask, did you,
satisfied with
I'm sorry, go ahead.
we weren't satisfied with the church that we were in. We were extremely dissatisfied with it. But
I was curious with what you said about homeschooling. Was there any sense of um, like maybe a shame if you didn't do it and you weren't exemplary? Like I know that when I was growing up, there was a lot of pressure to just make sure that there were certain boxes checked, such as, like you mentioned before, the dress codes. The modesty was certainly strongly woven in. That though certainly language was appropriate. The kids were never, kids were not cursing at all, not watching
right,
certain TV shows. There were just, there's a sense of which you want to be salt and light in the world, but you really don't want to be too connected to worldly kids. You want to be different and have a separation. And the bulk of your world is people that are just going to push you to Christ. And in that context, I think, especially for what I saw of my own mother and other Christian women, there was almost like a competition that I picked up on of like how godly can you be? And like if you could possibly be the kind of woman who would even have a blog eventually or write a book or lead a conference of women
Proverbs
about,
31 woman.
yeah, to be a Proverbs 31 woman, just exemplary and then some. That you could kind of have it all as well. You could be homeschooling, but you could also be making all these amazing homemade meals and keeping your house nice and ministering at the church and doing some kind of ministry, and maybe mentoring a young girl in the church, as like the Titus 2 passage talks about, that you were truly doing these things, but that if you were a truly godly woman, you wanted like all these circles were your passions, and to not pursue them, to not pursue mentoring young women or being in ministry or homeschooling or having very healthy meals for your kids or whatever, and Bible memorization, that you're kind of like you're leaving out good things for no reason. So why not pursue all these things? And even though I think some women did thrive in that I saw, it seemed like there was a competition going on. And I think some of the women who felt maybe less organized, and this is just my perspective, I certainly haven't heard this from women, but just it seemed like some women that were less organized maybe, or just couldn't do it, or maybe had other issues, maybe kids with ADHD that was undiagnosed or something, where just life is a struggle. I think they kind of felt like they were second class, or maybe if your kids were always pushing the bar as to how modest they would dress, and you're like, oh, all those struggles. I really felt bad for some women who would just never measure up to that bar. Did you feel that pressure at all?
At the point where we are in the story right now, I hadn't yet begun to really feel that pressure, because we only knew the one family at that point that homeschooled. The children that we ended up actually home churching with this family, so we had kind of known them pretty up close and personal enough to see their daily ins and outs. Other than that, we weren't aware of a homeschooling culture. There weren't groups, or anything.
Were you under any
Um,
quiverful pressure?
later on, yes.
Okay.
Later on, about 5 years, I'm going to say, on past this point, I was very heavily under all of that, all of the above. And yes, there were a lot of unrealistic expectations on these moms. We had a lot of plates to juggle and keep spinning all the time up in the air. And I saw uh, mother after mother crumple and fall, under the pressure. And eventually that's what happened to me.
Hmm.
Now I'm going to say I'm pregnant with my third baby. So I'm homeschooling my toddlers. I'm big pregnant, and my father one day on rounds at the hospital, they'd retired from the mission at this point, had come back, and we were living in the same area in Tennessee as them. My father was doing rounds at the hospital one morning, and his nurse thought he was talking funny, and they rushed him to a bigger hospital, thinking he was having a stroke. Ended up being a brain tumor. And so I have a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and I'm pregnant. My dad's dying from cancer. That was 1998. And that was definitely a faith crisis, in a big way. My faith held through that. Um, you know, there was a lot of suffering condensed into a very short, concentrated time period, and a lot to work through. I should have had therapy, which I did not get. I had 2 miscarriages between the second and third babies too. So physically I was, at a low, and we had been at that point very exposed and very bought into Quiverful. And when you said the thing about competition amongst women to be sort of the holiest mother or having the most going on, the area where I felt it most was in the area of number of children. The more babies, the more status, in those circles. And it didn't matter really too much, as long as you could kind of keep a basic appearance of not everything not falling completely apart. That was the main thing. Didn't really matter so much. There was a lot of leeway for unschooling, or, not having medical care, or, literally just things that are criminally neglect, in a lot of cases. Because that was the government being too nosy and too oversighty, and you didn't subject yourself to that. You were above that. You didn't receive food stamps, for sure. You did not let your kids be government tested, to see where they were in their grade and things like this. But yeah, it was more, how many do you have, not how well are they being cared for. I was pregnant with number 3. We were already hanging out with families who routinely had 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 kids. Yeah. So we felt, even by the time we had 6 kids, still felt like a small family.
That's amazing.
I didn't have a number that I was aiming for, but when we first got married, I thought 4 sounded like a lot. It was more than my family, because there were 3 in my family. 4 to me sounded like quite a handful, and I had no experience with children. My little brothers, I was at boarding school. I was 13 years older than my youngest brother, so 4 sounded like a lot. But then we had 4, and I was so indoctrinated. Even though I was ill at that point, I never once considered, that we maybe not do this anymore. The teaching really in a nutshell was that when you decline to be pregnant, that it's a slap in God's face, because He is sovereign and He's supposed to be the Lord of these big decisions. You don't have the wisdom to make such a decision, on your own. So if He doesn't think you're able to handle, He doesn't give us, trials that you can't handle. So surely if He allows you to become pregnant, it's because, that's what He intends to happen. So this was the mindset by that time.
Did you have any sense of the need to raise soldiers for Christ, so to speak, and outbreed the pagans?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. That was a discussion that was in the background at all times.
Yeah.
A
Like
couple
if
of
there's enough of us,
influences.
we'll just outvote the outvote the liberals.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
that, and I do remember hearing sort of the spiel on, I think there was like a 100-year plan or something. Someone has talked about where
Yeah.
they drew diagrams about, like, if you have this many kids and your kids have that many kids, and then, this is, I do remember having seen that. I remember we weren't Gothardites, but I was exposed to Gothard way back in West Virginia, in grade school at our home church. He was a visitor there. I know that I saw the red binders, there. But in my homeschooling pursuits, a couple of the influences that I came across were the pearls from Train Up a Child, the Ezos from Growing Kids God's Way, which was a very scheduled sort of infant care instruction, but it was all based on the theology of breaking the child's will, as were the pearls. And so, my poor kids, my first batch, because we kind of had four in that time, and then later the last three kind of came along after we eased up a little bit. But those first four kids, they were the guinea pigs, and we were doing all the things, the not responding when they cried, in the night, and
And the
things
goal is
like
just to
this.
break down their will.
Yeah, basically you're just teaching them that it's pointless because nobody's going to come.
Yeah.
And the corporal punishment, lots of that. The wretched, slumming stick that Mike Pearl, advocates that you go out and buy because it won't leave bruises, and things. And we weren't heavy on the spankings, but in my opinion, like, because from in comparison to how I was raised, there was quite a bit of spanking, in that time, but we weren't so heavy, but we did do it. And it got harder and harder as I got older. I think part of that was just emotional intelligence. I began to resent having to do it, even though I still felt compelled to do it. I was uncomfortable. I tried to do a lot of other things instead first, and it kind of became more of a last resort, whereas we were really taught that it should be the first resort, and then you won't have to worry about all the rest of it, if you just nip things in the bud with a good spanking. But I didn't see that pan out in my experience. That really didn't work that way. And I ended up having a child or two that it just didn't work on at all. Um, I learned later that there are several kids who have died at the hands of parents utilizing To Train Up a Child, the book. And they are all adopted children. And apparently the reason is because when a child is adopted and there's some bonding issues, there that aren't quite resolved, they literally will dig in their heels in just a self-defense mechanism, and you can spank them to death. And that's happened a handful of times
Mm.
in homes where they later went in and found that this was a resource that had been used. Um,
And would you say it
so
seems like that mentality, just the whole thing, is also just to translate our relationship with our human parents to our relationship with God. In other words, we certainly as Christian parents want our kids to be obedient and to listen to us and to do what they're told.
right,
But with the bigger, much more critical issue at stake of like, look, you need to listen to us because you need to learn to listen to your true father. And just like we might say, don't touch the stove because it's hot, God's going to say, don't do things in the flesh. Don't do things to try to earn your salvation. Listen to me. I have offered you salvation, because the true stove that's hot is hell. Even Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, stop trusting yourself, trust me, the Heavenly Father. Would you say that was part of your equation? You were trying to train them to trust God more?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. That pressure was that mental, reality was constantly there. And um, it fell so heavy on the mothers. I think we ended up hearing a lot of preaching that was very directed to us because, we're there for the majority part of the day when the father's out of the home. So we're the disciplinarians by and large, but there was a lot of guilting regarding, if you don't discipline correctly and really get that will broken early on, it almost was like your child pretty much guaranteed to go to hell.
Yeah.
So that was a
And
big
even
deal.
even on this earth that they're probably going to be criminal or at least acting out in ways that are. I remember Jim Dobson having a guy. We listened to Jim Dobson daily for years when I was growing up, and he had at one point this detective or some kind of police officer talking about. He went through this list of like what are the traits when you look at what a guy that's like eventually becomes a criminal, like a hardened criminal. What are the when they say what was your childhood like? If you were, now that you're a criminal in jail, tell us, in this interview, what did you grow up like? And they'll list out these traits, and then they'd say, when you look at the traits that these criminals would say that the way their childhood was like, they would say that's exactly what you're doing to a child when you don't discipline them in this way. You're basically leading them to be a criminal someday, if not, a true
Yeah.
criminal, at least to have a heart of a criminal, and it's certainly to have a desire to buck God at least, if not society. And it was just amazing how they would put the whole. This really goes back to the idea of original sin. Like you're born in sin, like you're wicked from the time you're born, and if we
Yeah.
don't beat this out of you, it's literally going to consume you and destroy your life.
Something really messed up that I think this was a Pearl teaching. I know that the Duggars did this, and it's kind of widely been discussed now that Shiny Happy People has come out. But the blanket training, and I remember doing that. And I was a young mom. My mom, who I wasn't close to anyway, but was in another country. I didn't have older women that I could really ask, and I was desperate for an authority, and I unfortunately, I read what was given to me, in church. And the blanket training basically was from the time that they can crawl. So we're talking 5 months. You put the blanket on the living room floor, put their favorite toy just off of the blanket, and wait for them to go get it. And then you spank them. So, it's cruel. It's it's just messed up. And then you wonder why so many fundamentalists, aren't close to their children once they're grown. The trust, you're breaking their trust from day one and basically teaching them that you are not to be trusted and you're not their friend.
Hmm,
But
it's crazy.
um I I had mentioned that we weren't happy with our church situation. And a lot of that was, I think, some self righteousness. By that time, we were very bought into, there was a certain way that things should be done. And we looked around and it wasn't being done that way. We didn't feel like we were being fed, whatever that was supposed to mean, in church. And I remember uh, one Sunday, I just couldn't hack it anymore. It started to sound like Charlie Brown's teacher from the pulpit. And I stood up in the middle of the sermon. I just turned to my ex and said, I can't do this anymore. So we left. We got the kids out of the nursery. We left. And then we just prayed. I think we were kind of aware that there was a thing called home churching. We didn't really understand all the ins and outs, but it sounded interesting. We were curious. So we kind of recruited around some other dissatisfied families in the church and got like 3 or 4 families together and just started very experimentally. Like none of us had any idea what we were doing, but we knew that we could just gather like in the New Testament time. That was what we thought we were going to do, was take it back to the New Testament times. before, organized religion became a thing, and we were going to do it the right way. And this, a lot of that came from my ex, as far as we're going to do this the right way. I just was tired of how it was. Whatever he wanted to do at that point was pretty much fine with me, I think, but I just didn't want to do what we were doing. So we started home churching. We'd always bring a meal. We'd hang out all day long. We literally were like overdosing on on fellowship and Bible and prayer and singing. We were building a sense of community for sure, but it was very unstructured. It was very free form, and that kind of worked for a while. Then my father passed, and we decided to move back to Kansas near my in-laws and give them a chance to be grandparents for a while. So we made this move. I had my son, my third baby that I was pregnant with when my dad was ill, hemorrhaged when he was born, had him at home, hemorrhaged. So just barely, like maybe 6 months after that, we picked up and made this big move from Tennessee to Kansas. And I remember I barely was conscious. I could barely sit up. I was still nursing, he kind of loaded me into the big, the moving van, and we made I guess it was a 12 or 14-hour drive. It was like the coldest day of the year. I remember we pulled into his folks' place, in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and they had this long rocky driveway, and it was just icy, and I was so stressed because I just knew we were going to go flying off into a pond or something. And we arrive, and they literally had to just like lay me out on the sofa. I had lost a lot of blood, the 6 months before. I had transfusions, but I just hadn't recuperated yet. And so there we were, living with his folks, no real plan. He decided to, his career was a teacher. He was a high school teacher. He decided to apply at some public schools. It would have been the first time he'd taught in public school, because he'd been in a Christian school teaching for 6 years. So he got the job. We're trying to save money, so we didn't get our own place. And it just was not good. I don't know if you've ever tried to live with your folks or your in-laws, but a couple of weeks here, when you've made a move and you're looking for a place. I think we were there for a year and a half or something. I had another miscarriage during that time, my third one, my last one, and it was severe. Without going into too much detail, I was at Walmart and had just found out I was pregnant and started miscarrying. The fetus, came out into the toilet, and I was bleeding everywhere, and we didn't call the ambulance because we didn't like that hospital. So I was rushed, in the car to the next town. An interesting thing, and I'm just going to throw this out because I have no idea what it means, but I don't know if it's even really significant. But when I was at the hospital by myself that night after my ex had gone home and taken the kid, I felt my dad's presence there with me, or that's what it seemed. That he didn't say anything, but I just knew he was there. And of course, he was a doctor, so it was extremely comforting. And so to relate it back to my spiritual state at this time, I was definitely struggling. I was in severe suffering. I was in severe state of exhaustion, really. There were a lot of things that should have been happening and that I needed to happen that weren't happening, such as medical care, such as therapy, such as, just help around the house, such as, my own space. And none of those boxes were being ticked. So it was just like a constant onslaught of all the things that will lead a person to burnout, and to a breakdown. And I was heading there fast. I lost that baby. I never knew if it was a boy or a girl. The hospital, took it, and it was really not ever mentioned again. And this was a consistent throughout my marriage, was like a flat response from from my ex as to things that happened that he was overwhelmed by or didn't know how to handle or what to say or do. It was sort of like the ostrich approach, if we just ignore it, it's not happening. And eventually on down the road, I sought out some resources for myself, and advocated for myself as much as I could, as little as I could. I did see a therapist, and when we got to the point, to the stage where I had lost that baby, I couldn't even tell the story. um, she said, you need to tell this story to about 3 or 4 different people. You need to tell it about 3 or 4 different times in order to process it. And, she was right. It was just so tightly bottled down. And I was angry. I was angry at God for allowing that to happen, because I felt so betrayed that I had given him complete freedom, complete reign over this decision, and had been slapped in the face, essentially. Um, I didn't understand, why that would be. And so I think probably my for real faith crisis kind of started with the death of my father, but then with that third miscarriage, um, was the second step towards a lot of questioning, and some pushing back. You know, it's a lot that happened in a 10-year stretch. Um, we eventually did get our own place, and he was teaching. We still were home churching, but it wasn't perfect. We tried to become Mennonite for a while. We visited a little Mennonite church, and that happened because back in Tennessee, I had made friends with a Mennonite lady that I met at the store, and she'd sewn some dresses for my girls, and we started dressing that way a lot. So in Kansas, we searched out a Mennonite congregation, and we went there for about 6 months. We loved it. We loved the people were very kind to us. The only thing that kept us from joining up was that they didn't believe in higher education, and that had been important to both of us. And my ex eventually went on and got 2 master's degrees after his math teaching degree. So we got a math master's and a statistics master's, and we just couldn't see ourselves really thriving in the environment where nobody wanted to talk about anything except crops. Basically that's their life. And
Hmm.
lovely people though. Um,
It's
so
amazing how
that didn't
many
work out.
it's amazing how many times you and our stories keep on having connections.
Oh, really?
I went to Mennonite church for a year, and I went to
I mean,
New
as
Tribes
we
Mission
do.
School. What was that?
Yes, yes, as we do. I mean, did you have a Catholic phase? Because that's next up.
I didn't know, but I'm curious to hear about it.
So there came a point, I in there at some point I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, and I had been ill, very ill, for about probably 4 good solid years. And we went through some different diagnoses. Like they said, well, it's irritable bowel, it's chronic fatigue. Well, those aren't really diagnoses; those are descriptions of what's happening. But I did test positive for Lyme finally. There wasn't a treatment that was helpful. I did the antibiotic route, and it didn't help. I had it too long at that point. But I'm still trying to homeschool. By this point, I have seven 7 children. Well, let's see. No, at the Lyme diagnosis, I think we still had 5 only. So we hadn't, we 7 is how many I have. But when we were still on number 5 is I think when I got diagnosed. So having that knowledge of, okay, this is what it is, sort of gave me the confidence, I guess, or the bravery or something to finally say, I don't think I can do this again next year, the homeschooling. So I just basically, it was clear I wasn't really doing it already. I mean, we were barely scraping by. They knew how to read, and do basic math. They weren't really getting schooled. My husband knew this. He was well aware, I was barely surviving, but it just seemed like I remember one time we still hung out. We lived next door to his parents now, and we still hung out over there quite a bit. And I had great in-laws. I really don't have any complaints about them. But one time I remember I was over at my mom-in-law's, and I would get faint, and I would just have to lay down, suddenly, like doing the dishes or whatever. And that happened one time. I was doing dishes over at her place. The kids were there playing, and I just had to lay down under the kitchen table. And she came up from downstairs, and she's kind of a shy lady. She's not super extroverted, and she saw that, I was laying down, and she said, well, I'm just going to assume that you just needed a nap all of a sudden, and I couldn't. It was like I was so beaten down emotionally and mentally, I couldn't ask for help. I knew that nobody could help me. Like it was clear that I was on my own, in this situation. And so she just went back downstairs. And it seemed to me that I was invisible. That's exactly how it felt. It felt like my suffering was invisible. It was not acknowledged. It was not addressed or treated. Um, and so I began to think it was very normalized, in my mind it became this is the new normal, and I'm just gonna have to deal with it. So that's when true clinical depression really set in, because I was defeated. I was 100% defeated. Um,
Can I ask, where were you
and
with God at that point? Like, did you feel like he was seeing it and caring?
it was distant. Uh, God it seemed like a joke, but um, but I wasn't ready to give up on the idea of God or even the idea of church yet. So we were home churching, and this is when in this time period something happened. It was an abuse situation in the home church towards one of my children. And I didn't become aware of it at the time. Not until later on down the road, several years on down the road, did I know about it. But this was what caused really was the end of my marriage when this happened. I didn't realize that at the time either. I just knew that trust was broken in such a way that it could not be repaired. And what had happened was um, one of my children had experienced, SA in the home church environment, and because we had the patriarchy mindset, she didn't come to me. She went to her father, and because she didn't have the language, and because she was embarrassed, she didn't make herself extremely clear, so he didn't get a full entire picture. And so his response was very less than it should have been. The man later on had moved away and was caught red-handed abusing one of his wife's grandchildren and is now in jail. But when this happened, the elders, including my ex in the home church, they interviewed the man to get his side of the story, and he gave them some nonsense song and dance about how he didn't mean it that way and whatnot. And so it was never brought up again. Well, this was the second time because it had happened previously to another girl before our daughter, and she also had brought it before the elders. I did know about that. It had been a couple of years earlier, but bottom line is my ex didn't tell me that this situation was going on with our daughter. He didn't feel it necessary to inform me of that because in his estimation, nothing had happened. Nothing significant had happened to make it that big of a deal over. And I was not seen as a partner. I wasn't seen as a friend even, I don't think. I was really seen as the oldest of the children as far as any type of authority or hierarchy. Fast forward about 4.5 years, we're sitting around. I'm having a conversation with some ladies and my daughter about this man that's now in jail. And my daughter says to me, yeah, sometimes I really wonder, what would have happened if it had been ended differently, in my situation. And I said, what do you mean? She had gone this whole time thinking that I knew about it. In her mind, she assumed that her dad would have told me about it. And that had caused a lot of confusion on her part as to why I never addressed it. So, it damaged our relationship. This is the first time hearing of it. My jaw fell open. I was simultaneously like all of the feelings, horrified, shocked, angered, outraged. I said to her, the only thing I could think to do, was to remedy the situation was that I offered to take her to make out a report, at the sheriff's office in that county where it happened. And it had been almost 5 years. So I didn't even know if it was going to be, too late, or I just said, if this is something that you feel you want to do, I will take you. And she said, yes, I do want to do that. And we left and got in the car and drove over, to the place to do that. So, I don't even remember what my ex said when I questioned him, why you didn't tell me this. I don't even remember. It was like it never occurred to him, to tell me. And that was the day that the marriage died. I didn't know it, but on through that process of me just feeling more and more disconnected in the family, in the marriage, in the church, from God. In a desperate attempt to salvage my faith, I looked out to the most unlikely place I could imagine, which was Catholicism. Now, when I had said I can't homeschool this year anymore, we looked around and we had two options. One was a Catholic school, one was Protestant, but the Protestant school was much more costly. So my ex very begrudgingly agreed that they could go to the Catholic school. I drove them an hour one way to school for an entire year. I often sat in town reading, waiting for them to get out of school for the whole day. And the second year that they went, we made a different arrangement where I didn't have to do that anymore. But it was a commitment and it was a change for all of us. And I got interested in the theology, and all I knew about it was what I'd been told by Protestants. Well, when I started doing some reading for my own, I quickly realized that Catholics didn't believe what I'd been told that they believed. So immediately there was the sense of, did people just not realize, or were they lying? or were they just outright lying? Like what was the motivation of presenting it in such a way that's quite different? So I was still a theology girl. I really was invested in getting right. Like I still very much believed that the Bible was inerrant, that it was the Word of God, that it was the revelation that we need, to make it in this world. But to be honest, it I couldn't make head or tails out of it myself. As far as people would always say, and my ex would say this a lot. Well, it's very clear. The passage is very clear, and I'd be like, it, I clearly see that about 10 different people have 10 different opinions on what it means. And this used to drive me so crazy in home church because we would sit around and someone would read the passage for the day. It was a man, of course. And then we'd all go around and everybody would say what they got from it or what they thought it meant. Even the women were allowed to do this. So there'd be about 8 or 9 of us saying sometimes radically different things about this passage and what we thought it meant. And then my dad-in-law would say, he kind of lean back and stretch like a big yawn and say, well, let's bring this in for a landing. That phrase began to trigger the hell out of me because I was like, what landing? Nobody has a clearer idea of what this means than we did when we started. At least I didn't. So the more that life kind of became more challenging and the stakes began to get higher as the children grew and got older, and it wasn't just a matter of, a band-aid on me anymore. And I had friends, who were struggling with the question of divorce and what does the Bible teach on that? I mean, I studied my brains out on that. I still couldn't give them what I thought was a good answer, or any kind of a meaningful conclusion on what does the Bible teach on this. So I was on the struggle bus, and I decided that I wanted to be Catholic. I liked the liturgy. I liked the structure. The home church situation, it was too triggering for me now. I couldn't participate anymore. It wasn't my home anymore. I discussed it with my ex. He was opposed, but he didn't want to be that guy that was going to say, no, you can't do something that you think God's calling you to do. He experienced a lot of outward pressure and peer pressure to sort of get me in line at that time. So that also put a big burden on our marriage. But
to sort of rescue you from Catholicism.
Yes, and to keep me under his authority, really his spiritual authority. It very much humiliated him that I felt the need to step out, and find something different than what he was providing. So more so though than outward peer pressure or opinions on what was happening, it was his complete disinterest in my struggle that really damaged our relationship, at that time. And I think that's something that you've kind of referred to, that you experienced as well. And that was confusing to me. I'm here still thinking we got all these kids and, we're both Christians. To me, it was never a deal breaker that maybe we might choose different churches to attend. I could see that it could present some challenges, but at this point, I'd been going to the Catholic Church enough to observe that lots of couples there were of mixed faith, and they seemed to be making it work just fine. Sometimes even I'd heard of a couple. Probably this was in some of the videos that I watched, when I was converting to Catholicism. But the husband or one of the spouses was an atheist, but they drove the rest of the family to church and sat out in the car while the family went to mass. And it was kind of like I was exposed to the idea or the concept that, number one, like we each have spiritual autonomy, because that was never a thing before. It was always, the umbrella, diagram where it's God, Jesus, the husband, then the wife, and the children. Everybody stays in their lane. But now I'm exposed to the idea that maybe we might have spiritual autonomy, and also that you can respect, your spouse's choices and support them, even though may not agree with them 100%. But that, you can still be a team, you can still make that work. But he never could come around to that view of things at all.
Mm.
And to him, I was abandoning, all hope. Very much to him, my soul was in danger. The theology was just clearly, not right. Um, but I went and I did it, and I got, I didn't get baptized because I'd been baptized in the Baptist church, and they actually accept that. So you just have to get your certificate and show it. But for a while, I found some comfort and some rest, just being able to go sit in the pew, literally just sit in the pew and not be guilted and shamed from the pulpit, because they weren't really big on that. They just basically read the scripture. The priest gave a very short, usually social justice type of a sermon. Then you took communion and you were out of there. And people didn't really mill around afterwards. It was a very different way of doing church than I was used to. And it was a sense of freedom. It was a sense of rest to me. So I enjoyed that for a while. COVID. I had sworn that I was never going to homeschool again. My health had recovered a bit. So I was doing better, but I'd had kids now that had been in Catholic school. I'd had a couple then that had gone on to public school even, so I had long ago let go of the goal of being the Proverbs 31 mom. That just wasn't going to happen. And I had to be okay with that. I remember one year that I went in to enroll, I think it was 3 of them into public school. And it was the first time, for public. And I was so overwhelmed. I just sat in the little office with these forms and bawled my face off. And it was this sense of, I have completely failed. Like failed, first of all, God, my husband, myself, and my kids, and it was a real low. Like my self-esteem was just in the gutter at this point.
Mm.
And I had to go no contact with my mother as well. So because for just mental health reasons, it just got to the point where I was expending too much energy trying to manage that. So I cut ties, and that was a good thing. I was in therapy. That was an awesome thing. My therapist supported me through that process of going no contact with my mother. And interesting aside, my therapist was a Christian. She is a Christian, and she's a pastor's wife, but she did not do Bible-based therapy. She was secular trained. She was excellent at it, and not a legalist in any way. So I just shout out, to her for being there and for really doing such a professional, awesome job, even though she's a Christian, because I think that's not really the norm with counseling with Christians. Is it tends to be not as practical and not as useful, to someone who is really experiencing a mental health crisis.
Yeah.
So I was very thankful to have found her. When no contact with my mother, it seemed like when I did that, that sort of cut a few more strings that had held my relationship to my ex together, because we kind of had been allies in the fight against my mother and her crazy, So when that wasn't there anymore, it's like that was one of the things that held us in common that no longer existed. I was going to a different church. We became very distant from one another emotionally, physically, all the ways. And I had said that I wasn't going to homeschool, but then COVID came and I'd had no choice. I had to bring then I think he was fifth grade, my baby, home and like dive back into this thing that I had definitely never planned on doing again. But we had a ball that year, and I was only focused. I only had him, so I was able to really kind of do it right, in a more thorough, better way than I felt I had done it before when I had so much on my plate. So we did all the unit studies and, all of the games and the crafts. And we were studying Roman and Greek mythology that year. And he loved it. And I exhausted myself, but I loved it. And within that year, I found an outlet with the online karaoke that I mentioned before. Somebody just mentioned it randomly. Did you know that that's a thing, that you can do? I'd never heard of it, but I downloaded the app. You have to find like a group, which they call your family, and you apply, and then, you have sort of a smaller base and you hang out. And so I started singing and I started getting my confidence back. That actually was the beginnings of my mental health getting a lot better. It was something that I felt confident in. I was getting a lot of feedback from my peers, people that really were good singers. Some of them even had almost had a professional careers in Nashville and things. And they were telling me, yeah, great job. And they love to sing with me. And
Mm.
so I think I was still I was not going to church as much either then because of COVID. So things kind of, yeah, they just naturally sort of unraveled there towards the end a little bit. I wasn't actively asking a lot of questions about God, but I kind of, I kind of had given up. I really, um, I wasn't feeling God present to me or available to me. I had become cynical for sure. My therapist told me at one point, she said, this is what I want you to do. She said, I want you to be selfish. And I was like, don't know if I can do that, but
That's awesome.
I remember I was scrolling through Instagram or something and I saw this thing called the Tough Mudder, which was a mud obstacle race. And I thought, and I was an athlete in high school, but I'd been through so much and I'd had such poor health that I didn't get to do fun stuff anymore. And I thought, that sounds so awesome. That sounds really fun. And it was in like 6 weeks. And I said to myself, I'm not anywhere near shape to do that, but what the heck, I'm just going to sign up anyway. It's not timed. It's not like you have to, finish it in a certain. So it was in Atlanta. Signed up for it, started training, I went and did it. And that spring that I did the Tough Mudder, um, I had been allowing myself, well, I did skip two things that I wanted to mention as to what brought me to the mindset that maybe I had some options other than just staying in this marriage and killing myself. um, One was the Catholic priest. I'd gone into him in desperation a couple of times when I was just really struggling over, is it even okay for me to like step out of my husband's authority and become Catholic? And I really at that time was very, very invested in making sure I was following the scripture. I just couldn't figure out what it said. And so I'd gone in to him and I did my whole spiel and I was so anxious. And I said, I've been told that I should obey my husband in everything unless he would ask me something to do something sinful, you know. And I said, you know, what do you say about that? And he knew sort of enough of my story, and he sort of chewed on that for a minute. And then he just said, it's a sin to take someone's autonomy from them. I was like, whoa, what? And he also asked me another pivotal question, which I'd never given myself permission to ask myself, which was, do you want to stay in this marriage? I didn't think it mattered, you know. So I meditated on those things that he had said to me for it was 10 years between that and when I ended up deciding that I want a divorce. But I had small kids, you know, so I really just couldn't it wasn't a situation where I could just yeet out of there, you know. So I stayed, but after COVID and Tough Mudder and sort of beginning to get a little bit of myself back, you know, just a tiny spark of hope is what it was. Um, I had been thinking in the back of my mind, sort of flirting with the idea of maybe when my youngest graduates high school, I might, I might not stay in this marriage then, you know, and just it was an idea that I let myself consider. But that spring, when I got real with myself, I understood that there wasn't enough left of me to make it 5 more years, which would have been how long until he graduated. Also, we had decided to sell our house in town and move back to the farm, which was my ex's family place, which was extremely remote and isolated. Um, and I think I just thought it's now or never. Like if I don't get out of this now, I'm going to be stuck there, and who knows if I'll make it out alive, literally, because um, historically that had not been a good situation for me mentally, and I had been suicidal, you know, multiple times, and so I decided to be selfish, and I decided to look out for me because nobody else was, and I said I want a divorce, and the way that things went down was not ideal, but my therapist kind of helped me with this, you know, because there's all the second guessing and Monday night quarterbacking of what if I would have did this different and things. But literally, there was no good way. That this was not like there was not a good way to do this. Every way was equally shitty. So it was rough on my kids, especially because it never was a question in their mind. You know, it was a complete shock. One of my older kids, I think, wasn't quite so shocked. My oldest son kind of took it in stride, but my two youngest that were still at home were fairly devastated. And of course, you know, later they told me when we had our family meeting, you know, and you guys announced that you were getting a divorce, they said, you know, Dad cried and was upset and emotional, and they said you just sat there cold, and you know they didn't understand. I didn't have any tears left at that point. I'd been crying for years in secret, um, you know, and hiding that from them. So there was nothing left. In fact, the literal opposite. Like I was so elated that I was potentially going to escape, you know, the prison that I was in. I could not, I tried so hard, but I knew that it was like when you cut a helium balloon and it just goes up, you know, I couldn't, I was bouncing. I was almost bouncing. Cause it was the hope factor again, you know, I had lived so long, you know, just in defeat. And finally I was doing the hardest thing. And I figured, you know, this will be this will be the hard part. And after that, I can just take it a day at a time. And that is what I did. But um, religious wise, I still glommed on to um, the comfort, I guess, that maybe there's something there, even though at this point I had literally like no spiritual life. It was, I had tried to go to church a couple of times through COVID and I had major anxiety attacks each time, and so I just kind of said, well, that's not for me right now. But I was still just saying right now, I wasn't putting any limits on it, time limits, but gradually through Instagram, through meeting people who were deconstructing, through meeting people who weren't Christians in real life. I made my first best friend, and she's not a church person, and um, just through experiencing a lot of things that typically you would experience as an adolescent, because I didn't go through that process. I was I was very much groomed to be dependent and to not worry about providing for myself. I wasn't quite as bad as like some friends that I know who like literally didn't have cars or didn't know how to drive, or things like that. But it was pretty bad, and I had no skills. And so I got out on my own. I got my apartment. I applied for a cleaning job and a waitressing job, and I loved doing both of those. So it was a rough time. It was a very steep learning curve, and I overindulged in alcohol for the first time in my life at 54, and literally almost ended up in the hospital. I probably should have been, but I didn't let the person call the ambulance.
Mm.
Um, but I had no idea, how much was too much for me. I just, you know,
With being at that point where you're kind of desperate for life to get better, were you at that point though questioning the whole idea of is this God real in the truest sense, or just was it more like he's let me down, therefore I don't feel like I can trust him? Or was it like what was getting it to eventually to a point of
it,
saying it's not as much I don't trust him, but maybe he's not actually there, maybe this is just mythology?
first it was very much the anger that kept me distant. I was angry about all the things that had happened and why they'd been allowed to happen that way. Then I say my give a damn got busted really well. Like I just didn't, for the longest time, I just didn't care. I didn't want to talk about God. I didn't want to, I couldn't read the scriptures because it was way too triggering. It had been so weaponized against me, like every bit of the Bible. I don't even own one anymore. I gave them all away, even my dad. I can't be around it. Um, so my give a damn got busted. I didn't care. I didn't want to think about it. I had spent so many years struggling, stressing myself out, trying to figure things out, trying to access God, trying to be pleasing to God. And finally I just said, I don't know if he's there or not. If he is, I'm pretty sure he's not the God of the Bible, pretty sure on that one. I said, he knows where to find me. you know i'm not I'm not going to struggle with it anymore. And as far as hell and eternity and the afterlife, again, don't really know, don't really care. Yes, I guess it would be horrible to suffer eternally, but I'm going to enjoy the rest of the time I have left here, because that I can control somewhat. I can make choices, I can advocate for myself. And I was thinking about this before I came on. How would I describe myself spiritually now? Don't know that I'd really say that I'm an atheist, but I definitely feel that I've become a hedonist. And also, though, a humanitarian. That's what I'd like to be, I guess. I, I'd like to be a humanitarian hedonist because um, I do think it matters how we live and how how we leave things in our path. Um, and I'd like to do things that benefit other people if possible. But I also definitely I'm never gonna neglect myself in order to reach out. I'm not gonna throw myself under the bus anymore. Um, not gonna be a martyr. When I left, of course there was a lot of shunning that went on within very much the church, but also within my family. It's getting better slowly, but uh, I went into it knowing that I was going to be the villain for sure, obviously. Um, and what comforts me, I guess, in that is that I know that I poured everything that I had, into the child rearing and the homeschooling and just being a mom. I did it till I had literally nothing left, and until I was forced into a position where I had to get out to survive. So it is what it is, and um, they're old enough now to where the youngest are 15 and 17. My oldest daughter is 29. So I feel that even if they never allow me to participate in their daily lives again, at least I got the chance to invest to the point that I did, and that's just going to have to be good enough, That so.
Hmm. I know I usually break in with a lot more questions throughout interviews, but I feel like it was important for me to kind of just sit back through a lot of this and listen. But it's amazing to me, just to kind of bring this to a wrap up point, how in so many different ways, no matter what the topic is, you get, so many of us get to a point where we just say either something like, this doesn't add up anymore, or I just can't do it anymore, or um, this whole thing is just crumbling in my hands. And
Right.
I remember people describing in different ways where maybe they're trying desperately to find reasons to hold on to their faith and to still believe.
Right.
And it just feels like you maybe have a shelf on a wall that's like, hanging by the most flimsy of hooks, and you're supposed to just keep on putting all these things on there, and this shelf is just ready to collapse, and you just keep putting stuff on there, and maybe it collapses once or twice, and you nail it back up and you super glue it, but the more you do it, it just keeps on collapsing. And some people obviously find ways to try to rebuild the whole bookshelf, and they find some way that they just have to stay because they just can't
Right.
grasp the idea. Like, it hurts more to think about losing eternity than to walk away from it. But for so many of us, it doesn't go that way. We just say, I just can't do this anymore. And it sounds like a lot of yours was just the non sequiturs. Like, this doesn't make sense. If God was going to show up and this was going to be healthy, if the joy of the Lord was going to be here, if there's going to be some sense of, like, I think it was in First or Second Peter where it says, after you've suffered for a while, the Lord will strengthen and settle you. Well, the strength and settling never comes, and his yoke is not easy. His burden is not light. It's actually quite hard. And you said it would be easy, but it's never been that way. It doesn't make sense, and there's all these issues. And the more you try to make this, this square piece fit into a round hole of the puzzle, it's like, I can't do it anymore. And your path was definitely different, at least at the end for me, in terms of the reasons that I left. Yours, it sounds like, were much more about the again, the non sequiturs and the emotional reality that God was never showing up big and never coming into your world and actually transforming it and making it healthy, making it even safe. Mine had, for whatever reason, had to be more about the mythology and the comparative mythology and the mystery cults of the Greco-Roman world. But
Right.
whatever the issues
Right.
are, like, we just, at some
Mhm.
point, so many of us get to that point where it collapses. And I remember, do you remember those I don't know if they still do it, but those old time booths. You'd see it like a fair where somebody would sit on this board, and it's over a little miniature pool, and you're throwing like softballs at this little bullseye. And eventually, you might miss, but eventually somebody's got a good hand and they're actually going to hit that bullseye. And when they do, the board has some kind of, very flimsy latch and just opens and the person falls in the water, of course, and
Mm-hmm.
everybody laughs. But it's like, it gets to that point where everything is just that flimsy. It's just a little flimsy latch holding it all together. You get one softball that hits right on target. It's like, bam, it's over.
Right.
I'm in the pool.
Right.
And
Right.
I my heart's broken for what you went through. I mean, it feels like there was a lot, also not just the pain, but also misunderstanding of the fact that you didn't have a voice this whole time to explain
Right.
what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely, the scripture. So the church and the way that I saw church, before being Catholic, that lost its authority first, right? Then scripture eventually lost its authority because even though, I think that was part of why I glommed on to Catholicism, because it made more sense to me as to how they claimed the authority to interpret scripture, because they did the canon, right? But then eventually on down the road, it 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 did get to be where it still just didn't add up. Uh, it would just became it did not become the authority to me anymore. I couldn't trust it. I couldn't I couldn't understand, how there could be so many discrepancies and changes and errors, and why does how can God expect us to live right and obey Him if we can't make head or tails of His revelation and nobody agrees on what it means? That's just that's just crazy talk. And I don't have time for it anymore. I refuse to waste any more of my time even caring about it. Um, so when people say, well, aren't you afraid, of punishment or this or that? No, I'm really not. And it's like you've said many times, if God's such a good father, a good parent, um, then he at least has to be a better parent than I would even be.
Yeah.
And so you don't punish people for things that they can't control or help or so.
Mm. I think too, it's a good
Um,
point you make that once the Bible becomes irrelevant to your life, whether it's more academic or more practical or whatever you'd say, just once the Bible becomes irrelevant and you start to look at even just your own heart for wisdom, looking at your own heart or at other counselors, secular counseling, once the Bible becomes irrelevant and sidelined, it opens the door for us to finally see that this isn't what we thought it was, and it doesn't have the power. And that the autonomy thing that you brought up, where you're starting to bring it back and you're waking up for the first time and thinking, not just that I can have autonomy, but also I'm responsible for myself. Like at some point,
exactly.
I need to take control of my own heart and my own mind,
Exactly.
and not let all these other people dictate to me what I need to be thinking and feeling. And it's amazing, this journey. I love. I really appreciate you being willing to be vulnerable through this, because it's such a. Yours is definitely one of the more painful stories that I've heard. At least I'm sure there's some pain people have had that just haven't taken it that route in the interviews. But in terms of just what's actually been shared on this platform, yours is definitely one of the more painful stories I've heard, and my heart breaks for what you've been through. Could I ask, maybe to wrap us up, how are you doing at this point with healing from it all?
I mean, I'm still in therapy. Um, I do have a lot of triggers, and I do have complex PTSD. But I'm happy. It. I I'm bitter. I am. I'm angry and bitter about things that didn't have to be how they were. They really just didn't have to. But life goes on, and I'm remarried now. My top requirement when I was looking to date again was that the person be not be religious, and he's not. Um, and so on Sunday mornings, we sit around in our boxers and have coffee and like watch funny videos and cat videos. And, you know, we're very well matched. And it's the privilege to experience finally, you know, being part of a team with my spouse. And the whole marriage thing, you know, that was his idea, and it is sort of a box of big triggers for me in a way, but it's very cool to get to experience it now in a different way, you know, and that is healing. And so I do think it's interesting to kind of consider how a spouse coming into a marriage to someone like me, you know, or somebody that's deconstructed. I've heard that in a couple of your other different interviews where people end up married again and the new spouse doesn't have the background, the fundamentalist background. And so, you know, there's a big learning curve there too for him, as to, you know, why certain things, you know, can get to me or bother me, or, you know, just, you know, the whole idea of headship in marriage to him, it's not even a thing, you know. So
That's awesome.
It it's a destructive, fundamentalism is a destructive construct just on the, you know, due to its very nature. And my my hope as to why I'm sharing this and what I'd like to do going forward in life is to just, yeah, be a resource for people who need a different way, you know, who'd like to do it differently, but just don't quite know if it's possible, or, you know, or what that would look like. But it does get better.
Yeah.
It's a lot
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
Almost immediately.
I would do that. It's amazing. Yeah. It takes a lot of bravery and getting over some of the fear of the obviously hell and what God's thinking and what your community's thinking. But yeah, just to have that bravery, to be willing to step out and to rebuild. I mean, it's a lot of it's rebuilding, but well, I will definitely be wishing, you know, good things and healing, continued healing for you and your kids through all this. But
Thank you.
I'm so glad to hear about your just the beauty and, you know, loving kindness in a good relationship can certainly be very healing. It's awesome to hear that too. So, well, I know we've gone long, so I would love though to kind of as I say a lot, you know, check in with you at some point in a year or two and to see how things are going, and maybe either hear more of the story or if there's a topic on your mind. But just want to say thank you for today, for sharing your story. I'm sure there's people that can definitely relate and have been influenced by it.
I hope so. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Sarah Louise Gross. Sarah, thank you so much. Great to get to know you. Thanks again.
You take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.